Right, hello everyone. Welcome to the second monthly publisher webinar. We will kick off now. The numbers are still going up, but we will get going with the housekeeping to make sure we finish on time. So my name is Sophie. Hi everyone. I am the marketing officer, one of the marketing officers here at OpenAthens. And this month we are joined again by Kieran Prince, who is the International Sales Manager for OpenAthens. And also this month we have Jake Smallridge, who is one of the product managers here at OpenAthens. So if we just move on the slides, Kieran, we'll just cover the housekeeping, which all of you will know by now, I'm sure. We are recording this and the presentation will be made available afterwards for you in case you miss any information or you'd like to pass on the recording of this to your colleagues. We cannot see or hear any of you, so do not worry if you have any noise or distraction in the background. We can't hear you. But please, if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A box that you'll find in the bottom toolbar of Zoom. And if you do have any technical problems, please get in contact with the chat box and I'll be more than happy to try and help you. So just to move on to the next slide and just give a quick 30 seconds explanation of what this webinar is for those of you who are new. So this webinar series is a regular series just for our publisher and service provider customers. So before we started this webinar series, we were quite dissatisfied with the numbers of opportunities we provided our publisher and service provider customers. You know, the number of opportunities we gave you to speak to us directly. And so we designed this monthly webinar series in order to keep you up to date on the product, you know, making sure you're staying up to date with planned changes, listening to your questions, and also just discussing and presenting on key functionalities of your OpenAthens product. So hopefully you'll learn something new today. Hopefully you will, well, you might know everything that we're going to be presenting, which is great, but hopefully you will take away at least one new thing from this webinar. Yes, that is our aim. So that's enough from me. I'm going to pass on to Kieran, who is going to kick us off today with the webinar focusing on attributes. Over to you, Kieran.
There we go. So yeah, hopefully you can all hear me loud and clear.
Yeah, all good.
Cool. So yeah, no, we appreciate you being here. I know we've been cranking out these webinars a lot recently, but yeah, it's always great to get your feedback and be in front of you more so now than ever before. So yeah, this week we'll be talking about attributes, essentially the key component to how OpenAthens and other SAML-based systems work. Starting from the bottom, we'll discuss what attributes are and how they allow publishers to manage access into their content. We'll then speak about how attributes are defined and who defines them, and then how attributes can provide a much more granular experience in terms of the authorization and as well as personalization. Before I hand over to Jake, our product manager, who will be previewing a new product release that's due to be released very soon, and it's also very relevant to today's topic. So yeah, as mentioned, hopefully you can see that we're getting more into the product side of things as we go forward through the webinar, and hopefully that will help you get the most out of the services we provide. So what are attributes? Put simply, they're information about a user that is supplied by a library. So every time a user logs into your platform through OpenAthens or another SAML service, you receive information about that user and where they're from. What information is released by the user is defined by the librarian or the administrator at the user's organization. They own that data. So SAML ensures these attributes are standardized, and this standardization underpins how OpenAthens and other federations operate. So those predefined rules about how attributes are formulated allows publishers and libraries to much more easily connect with each other. So they don't need to create those bespoke integrations with each other if they follow the guidelines that the federations set. So the two attributes highlighted green are what we call standard attributes. They are always released by the user, and we will talk a bit more about standard attributes in the next slide. Entity ID is also a standard attribute across most federations or all federations, but I purposely left it red here as OpenAthens requires publishers to use the scope to identify and authorize access to an organization much more often than the entity ID. To give you an example of why we do this, the NHS in England has one entity ID, but that is made up of 300 individual hospitals and trusts, each with their own licensing budgets. So giving each trust its own scope allows them to purchase content locally. And then publishers can be safe in the knowledge that only those users will access the licensed content. And this is just as common in the public library space, for example, where consortiums can be made up of hundreds or thousands of individual libraries, each with their own purchasing power. The additional, or what we would call extended attributes on this slide, are by no means standards, but the general rule with federated authentication is use as little information as you need in order to provide access to your content. However, this isn't one size fits all, which we will discuss a little bit later on. So why do we need attributes? For a long time, and arguably still, IP authentication was the primary method of authentication for libraries and publishers. However, libraries are moving to SAML-based systems like OpenAthens to gain a better insight into how users consume the content they're purchasing. Attributes give a much more granular view of usage of those resources, and they can often help inform renewal decisions. But for publishers, attributes do the same thing. They get granular insight, but more importantly, they get that security blanket, ensuring that only legitimate users can access licensed content. It's much easier to spoof an IP address than it is to hack SAML, which, as far as we know, is impossible. But obviously, you have examples of compromised credentials. But being able to identify an individual account enables publishers to shut down the problem at a much more micro level while maintaining access for other users. So in the past, we've heard from librarians who've had access to a particular journal shut down because an IP address has been spoofed. So librarians have that accountability, the users have that accountability for how they're interacting with different platforms. So these are the standard attributes defined by OpenAthens. And by standards, I mean, these will always be released by a user when they log into your platform. So again, standardizing these attributes across federations provides that scalability to you as a publisher. But there are some nuances to individual federations. But overall, they operate a very similar model. For example, one nuance to the way OpenAthens operates is the use of scoped affiliation. You may see in other federations, they refer to this as something similar, edgy person affiliation, which is not used by OpenAthens. We prefer to use scoped affiliation for the reasons outlined earlier. Working with many kind of consortium level organizations, it provides the granularity they need and the granularity that publishers require. Targeted ID, or its longer form, edgy person targeted ID, is a unique value for a user for your platform. Now, this allows you to identify repeat users, as it will always be the same value for that user. Now, this can be used in a number of ways, one being you can tie personalization to that value. But because you can identify a returning user, you can provide things like search history or allow them to save content. And these types of enhancements can greatly increase the engagement users have with your platform. You can do this without identifying who the user is, which supports their right to anonymity. This unique value also provides you with a much more granular insight into usage, because you can tell the difference between one user accessing your platform 100 times or 100 users accessing it once. And finally, it echoes that accountability. You can identify when there's been a large number of downloads, for example, from an individual account. And although as a publisher, you can't identify that individual, you can work with a librarian to identify who that person is and lock down their account. So now we get to non-standard, or what we refer to as extended attributes. Of course, these are much less common than standard attributes, which are always released, but they're still used by libraries and publishers to define a much more granular way of accessing licensed content. And the great thing about SAML is that standardization and that scalability, but you also have lots of flexibility when it comes to what information you can receive. If you wanted to sell a license to a particular faculty, You can agree with that organization to release this information as an attribute, ensuring you have much more control over who is accessing your content. And the libraries get peace of mind that only legitimate users are getting access to that often expensive content. But there was one caveat which is outlined in the quotes provided here. And these are quite common across the board. Librarians are probably more sensitive about releasing information than the users themselves. And one common complaint we hear from librarians is when publishers ask them to release a user's email, which again is relatively common and seems to be increasingly common. But unless the publisher can justify their reasons for needing this, you will always get opposition from librarians who own that data. So yeah, I'll stress again that personally identifiable information is generally a no-no. Unless it's essential for the functionality of your platform. If you have a specialized platform with lots of functionality that is tied into things like email, then by all means you can certainly justify that. And this type of approach is common across all federations. Releasing as little information as possible is the status quo. And in fact, if any of you are part of Edugain, you will already have a privacy policy in place because they mandate you have that in place and agree to consume as little data about users as possible. And if you do receive personal information, you will do nothing but administrative things with that content. You won't use it for anything like marketing or upsell opportunities. So granular attributes are a great way for you to provide more granular access to defined sets of users. But of course, managing individual attribute policies with each one of your customers can prove time consuming and often difficult to manage. You don't get that scalability. But there is an alternative, something known as entity categories. And I provided one example of these here. Some of you may already be aware of this. The research and scholarship, or RNS entity category, it defines a really simple and scalable way to streamline federated research. So libraries and publishers agree on basic predefined information to be released to all publishers who support the entity category. And this has a number of benefits, the convenience of not having to manage individual attribute policies with your customers. And it doesn't involve IT teams on either side because it's predefined and agreed to. So there's none of this back and forth about which attributes you require. Whether you need email address and then getting a no and then going back for more information from the library. It takes away that barrier to entry and makes it a lot more feasible. So we'll provide links to supporting RNS at the end of the webinar. But it's certainly worth looking into. It's widely adopted and again gives you that scalability and ease of use. So we've spoken about attributes and using them to enable secure access to your platform. But beyond the federations like OpenAthens, who defines the attributes? So this is where librarians hold the key. They own their users' data, so they have final say over which information is released to a publisher. This is a good thing because publishers don't have responsibility for that data because they're not using it in the same way as librarians are. But this is a screenshot to show you exactly how they do this in the OpenAthens admin area. So librarians are able to allocate resources to defined sets of users, and they can then define which attributes will be released by them when they log in. So if a publisher requires any extended attributes from a library, it can definitely not be assumed that they will release it, but the librarians certainly have the ability to easily release attributes to a publisher for defined sets of users. But yeah, this is why we urge publishers like yourself to have pre-arranged, pre-agreed attribute policies with your customers. And if you can be consistent with that, that's absolutely great. But one benefit to this system is that, again, publishers do not own that data. So in terms of data protection, it puts you in good stead going forward. It's worth noting that librarians appear to make use of much more granular attributes than publishers do. So they will often release these attributes for a resource so they get that granular insight into who's using the platform. But it's not often the case that publishers are consuming it. So we would urge you to kind of look into more granular attribute policies with your customers, of course, without going into personal information, but often publishers will just use the scope, but you have the ability to get much more granular than that and get more insight into specific sets of users or even individual users when they're accessing your platform. So before I summarize, we're going to take a last look at that personalization. So something that the majority of users favor, as we mentioned in the last webinar, but something again that not enough publishers make use of. There's a few ways you can provide personalization. The most common is to confront the user with a form to fill out the first time they log in. But again, this can be daunting for a user because you're asking for personal information. But you can use the EduPerson targeted ID to provide pseudonymous personalization without identifying who the user is, and tying those additional services around that individual user, things like recommended content or search history. Personalization essentially out of the box with SAML. So yeah, by no means do you have to collect personal information. You already have the tools to provide that personalized experience without having to identify who the individual is. And of course, that is great for GDPR. So in summary, attributes provide granular authentication and authorization. So the authentication is done by the library, and it allows you to provide more granular authorization if you require it through those attribute release policies. Standard attributes are always released and are the bare minimum for authorization, but extended attributes can provide you with much more granular authorization if required. So if you do need to sell licensing to a particular faculty or at an organization, you can certainly do that through an attribute release policy. But when you do this, please avoid personally identifiable attributes like email when possible, even to the point that you'll often get opposition from libraries anyway. So by asking for it, you do cause suspicion with a lot of libraries. So yeah, avoid that as soon as possible, as much as possible. Entity categories allow for pre-approved attribute release to increase scalability, and these can often and always can also be used for creating essentially mini federations. So there's been, I think there's been a few pilots now looking at providing or building kind of mini federations by using entity categories and have those pre-approved attribute release policies within that. So yeah, librarians have control over user data. So we urge you to be upfront about what attributes you require, and Jake will touch on this a little bit later on. And if you can be consistent with that approach, that will just aid you in your ability to be scalable, but also being providing visibility to the librarians themselves. And again, personalization can be tied to the targeted ID, which is a default attribute, so it's always released. So you can make of that what you will, but providing personalization around that identifier is certainly recommended without that personal information being tied to it. I think that's me. I don't know if we're saving for questions now or are we going to save that for the end?
So we actually don't have any questions at the moment, which I will take as you answered as much, that everyone needed to know. Kieran, yeah. So don't worry at all. But I will encourage everyone, if you do have any questions, please use the Q&A box and we will make sure I'll delegate them to either Kieran or Jake. And yeah, apologies if you had some audio issues there. Occasionally, I think Kieran's audio was a bit blurry, but I think, for the most part, it was very clear.
It's the wonders of work from home, I think. So yeah, apologies for that.
That's okay.
That's
okay. Don't worry.
I should stop streaming film presenting.
Yeah, no, that's
so
fine.
Jake, I'm going now, so I'll hand over to you.
Just getting same presentation up on my screen just to get that slide up. Cool. So thanks a lot, Kieran. This will be a bit of a kind of introduction to some new functionality that we've been working on recently that really does tie in with all of this this really important part of OpenAthens, which is attributes and getting getting that release working as well as possible. So this piece of work that I'm going to talk about in a minute, just to sort of give a little bit of the background to it and kind of maybe bring to life a little bit how those attributes work kind of in the real world. So we started this piece of work by doing lots of interviews with our customers to try and understand how they manage this attribute release policy, how they set them, what processes they have in place when onboarding new customers. And this was in the context really of trying to make sure that we've got the best onboarding process we can. We know that it's a process that can sometimes take a while, and we know that one of the real pain points in that process can be the process of agreeing what attributes are required, because it's not always clear. And we know that's especially true when we get to, you know, publishers that have a more complex setup when it comes to attributes. As Kieran was saying, they may be using extended attributes, they may have different requirements for their different applications. It may be not always consistent. There may be perfectly good reasons for that, but it can be an area that does get quite complicated quite quickly, and it can cause a lot of confusion and misunderstandings and back and forth when it comes to actually setting up new customers, which is what anyone wants, or when moving customers from IP to federated authentication. It can cause delays in that process, which is good for neither libraries or for publishers. So through that research we did, we saw that there's a really clear need to try and make sure that we could improve and simplify that process around attribute release and getting clear understanding around what it is exactly that publishers require to make that information, to capture that information and store it as easily as possible. So let me just stop sharing that and hop over to this screen. So what I'm going to demo now is kind of the work that's come out for that, and is what's in development at the moment. So it's in development at the moment. So it's can't show you it up and running yet. We're hoping to release it in probably about a month's time, probably sort of towards the end of November. This is to kind of give an example. This is just a UI mock-up that we're using. This isn't a real account or anything. This is just a sort of made-up example. So within the applications section of the dashboard that you'll all have access to, once you select an application, you'll see once we've released the update that there'll be this new tab within it, this attributes tab. And within there, you'll be able to specify and you'll be able to add required and optional attributes in there. So as Kieran was mentioning around, there's kind of more standard attributes which will be required for authentication, and that would be, you know, what you'd put in that required category, those elements that you need to get authentication to work. So that would be things like, you know, scope, for example, that you'd put in there as those attributes that are absolutely required for authentication. And then you also have the option there to add optional ones, and that probably more linked in with where Kieran was talking around extended attributes, where you may want to offer personalization. And that may be stuff that those may be attributes that you're able to accept, but they're not absolutely essential for your service to work or to run. So there's our differentiation between the two, and this again gives you that flexibility in your setups to, you know, accept attributes if they are released by the IDPs, but they're not absolutely required. So the concept is that you're able to go into the product and really simply and really easily specify exactly what your attribute requirements are. So just to sort of walk it through, you could just go in. There'll be a sort of, you can type them in, and there's a bit of a type ahead, and it'll kind of give you the options there, and you can select which attributes from that list and that you want to add. Again, we're starting with just sort of standard attributes for the time being. I know sometimes you can get kind of custom ones, which is sort of a bit of an overlap with those extended attributes that we spoke about, that Kieran spoke about, where you can sort of define completely, completely new attributes. This will just be confined to those sort of standard attributes that are agreed SAML, agreed as part of SAML for the time being. But we know that this list will cover the vast majority of setups that we've got out there. So you can add your attributes in there, and then you add all the ones that you've got that you require or that are optional in there, and then publish those changes. And then when you publish those changes, that information will actually be updated within your OpenAthens Federation metadata, so that'll be stored publicly. So it's available to anyone that wants to look at it within the metadata. And as we'll come onto in a minute, then once we've got it stored in that way, we can then use that in various other ways. But I'll come on to that a little bit in a minute. One other thing just worth flagging at this stage is that this is functionality that already exists within some other federations. So the UK Federation, for example, lets you already specify within the metadata of that federation what your required and optional attributes are. So we'll actually be able to pull those in to the dashboard and display them within here if you've got those specified elsewhere already, which will save you having to do that again, which will be really useful. But obviously, it'd be good to still go in there and make sure that we're putting what we're putting is correct and is up to date, because it may be that the information stored elsewhere is not up to date. But this will give you visibility of that quite easily. Cool. So just flicking back to.
Do you have a couple of questions, Jake, if that's all right, before we continue? So whilst you load up your slides. The first question is, how do I ensure my library customers are releasing the required attributes?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question. So this doesn't, so for the time being, this piece of work won't necessarily replace that conversation completely with your library customers. So you'll still be required to have that conversation to make sure they're releasing the right elements. But in time, the idea with this piece of work is that we build up that kind of bank of information on what it is the publishers require, and then we can start to, in future phases of this piece of work, actually build that into processes so that we can be really upfront with, as Kieran was saying, be really upfront with libraries around what attributes different customers require. So for this phase, it's kind of capturing that information from publishers, but over time we can then build that into processes to make that conversation with libraries that much smoother.
Yeah, I think the reason we've developed this is for that kind of onboarding process. So you know, having that back and forth with the library about which attributes are required, which attributes are supposed to be released. We're hoping to alleviate this and actually build it into the product itself. So there's none of that kind of, you know, expecting customer service reps to understand what OpenAthens is and then communicating that to their customer. We're trying to build this into the product itself. So it's much more kind of proactive about setting up your customers for you.
Great, awesome. Another question is, how quickly are changes pushed out to the Federation metadata?
So yeah, so updates to the Federation metadata will be instant once you publish the changes in that top right hand corner. But obviously you can update that whenever you like. So it's not sort of once and done. It's not fixed.
Awesome.
Cool. So yeah, so in terms of, yeah, kind of as we were starting to get into, I guess, why are we making this change? What are the benefits that we see from it? So the first one there is around that better understanding of attributes and attribute release policies. And it's kind of where, you know, a webinar like this comes into that. Really is we're really, you know, keen for publishers make the most of this functionality. It's a really core part of SAML, one of the main advantages of using federated access. So ensuring that publishers have a really clear understanding of what attributes they require, why they require them, how they're using them, because that gives, you know, make sure that publishers are making the most out of the product. And then at a broader level, it also helps understanding across the OpenAthens community when it comes to attributes and starting to build that clearer picture and that real understanding across the OpenAthens community around what attributes are required. Second piece there is around troubleshooting. So you know, one of the first questions that our support teams will almost always ask when there are access issues is around attribute release policies and whether those are aligned on the library and publisher side. And again, by having this information stored, it will speed up that process because they'll be able to far far more quickly identify any mismatches in terms of attributes being released and requirements on either side. So it helps speed up with troubleshooting. And then, as we were saying a minute ago, this is probably sort of a longer term ambition, but once we've got this information for publishers, we can then start building this into processes around setups. So as Kim was saying, one of the biggest, from the research we've done, one of the biggest portions of time when it comes to setup is often the back and forth between publishers, and one of the trickiest bits to get right is that attribute release and making sure that everyone's on the same page in terms of understanding what's required by the other party to get that attribute exchange up and running. So this is work that once we've built out this bank of information really helps us to improve that process for the benefit of all of OpenAthens customers. So those are the benefits, and then in terms of kind of what this needs from you guys, our publisher customers going forward. So again, as I said at the start, we're hoping to release the functionality which I demoed to you a minute ago in sort of late November at the moment. That's the sort of ballpark figure that we're aiming for. But I think before that, and I think this is where it's quite a good timing, is that kind of first step is really, and this is kind of the takeaway from the webinar really, is to make sure that you guys really understand what your attribute requirements are and why you require them. Some of you may be able to, tell us right now exactly what they are, but some of you may need to go and do some investigation and just work out what those policies are in place at your different organisations, because it is a complicated field, and there can be some misunderstanding. So really building an understanding of what attributes you require is probably that first step, and then second step there really is to then go in and make the most of that functionality and go in there and either, if you go in and it's blank, put in the attributes that you guys require through that journey that I just showed you, and if you go in and the information is correct, then or it's been pulled from another federation and the information is correct, then happy days. If not, then just a little tweak you can make right there within the dashboard to any information that's pulled in to make sure that we've got the correct attribute policies stored for you within the product there, and then keeping that up to date over time. But I think attribute policies don't tend to change that much from month to month, but obviously any changes that you make affecting those within the product will be really key to making sure that we've got the correct information in there for you guys. And then the last bit is more just a bit of a general plug from the product manager to go in there and just play with some of the other features that we've got in there. We've recently released some functionality around reports to give you guys a far better visibility of where access is coming from via the OpenAthens Federation, so you can have a bit more of a view of what the federated transfer stats are like from your guys' perspective, and that's something we're going to look to develop over the next few months as well. So that's a space to keep an eye on, and sort of a bit of a plug really for that piece of functionality that we released a couple of months ago now. I don't know what the next slide is. So save that one. So that's the new piece of functionality we're hoping to release next month. We're really excited about getting out there because, as we say, this is a real foundational piece that lets us do lots of exciting things and for the benefit of the whole OpenAthens community going forward. So this is something where really need your guys' support and engagement on to make success of, but the potential benefits are really, really huge.
So before we move on to the poll, we just have some more questions that have come in. A couple of people have said, have asked about access and how to find the dashboard. Could you just help them with that?
Yeah,
yes. Do you take that one, Kieran?
URL is sd.openathens.net, which we can share after the webinar in our follow-up email.
Could you copy and paste it into the chat as well, because then people can have it.
No worries. So there will generally be one allocated admin for that dashboard, usually a technical contact like a developer or a product manager. So yeah, we can certainly share that link, but if you don't have credentials, then just let us know and we can create them for you.
Awesome. So the other question is, are service provider reports counter compliant?
No, not at this stage. Yeah, so like I say, we've got it at the moment. It's kind of a bit of an MVP, so we're keen to sort of plug it for you guys to go in and have a little bit of play around with But that's definitely something for us to explore in the future, I think. And that's where I'm saying, yeah, building a bit of a roadmap for that reports functionality at the moment.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. For librarians, they often use counter alongside OpenAthens stats because they get that granularity from OpenAthens at the platform level, but then they get the journal or article level access for counter. So the two work alongside together quite nicely. But yeah, having one place to go for that information would be great, I think.
Awesome, great. And we've had some other questions about how can we find out more about attributes, and some kind of questions on finding out about attribute release policies, and is there a standard policy? I guess after the poll, maybe we can, for anyone who answers no, maybe you guys could just touch on addressing those questions. But should we do the poll first? So we can just get an idea.
Cool.
Yeah, so Jake had the idea just for our interest. Those of you here, do you know what your attribute release policy is? And we're going to put out a really quick poll. It's just going to be yes or no. We have tested this, so fingers crossed it's still going to work. So it's anonymous. It's just a yes or a no for our understanding. So we've had 50% of the votes. We'll just stay open for another 10 seconds. Okay, lovely. So we'll just stop there. We've had about half of you. And that's told us that of those who answered, 47% of you don't know what your attribute policy is. So linked to those questions and linked to that polling answer, Jake and Kieran, can we address what these people need to do?
Yeah, well, so I think the first question is probably it will have been set up within your organization when you set up MyAthens. So either someone in your organization probably has an idea, and then in terms of if struggling on that front, that's something I believe we can help with. Don't want to get Kieran in trouble here, but I believe that's something we can definitely help you with. And with the release of this new functionality, that's definitely something we'll be making a push on our side through our support teams, is to try and make sure we get that information captured where we can. So I think that's definitely something we should be able to help with. But I'd say, yeah, first port of call is probably internally. Whoever sort of managed to set up probably have a good idea of what that policy is on your guys' side.
Yeah, I think you're right, Jake. And I think, for some publishers who've been with us for many years, that's been in place for a long time. And I think if you've said no, that probably suggests you're using the standard attribute policy, which is great. That would be my assumption. But yeah, it's certainly worth looking into, if only to try and make use of more granular authorization if you need it. I think that's certainly something we're urging publishers to kind of look into, to give them much greater insight into user behavior at a much more granular level, whether it's for faculty or other attributes. I think it's you have the tools already to go into that sort of detail. Librarians are doing it, so yeah, we're great for publishers to make more use of that kind of data.
Awesome. And the last question that's come in: will the dashboard eventually support federations that do not use eduperson attributes, such as Norway? In Norway, we use I don't know how to pronounce that. SCHLAC home. Schlackhome, I think that might be. I'm sorry if I've completely murdered that pronunciation. Instead of eduperson or scoped affiliation.
That's a very good question. Probably one I'm not able to answer right now. I'll probably have to go and talk to our SAML expert about what the plans are for supporting other areas. But I can pick that up with you separately.
Yes.
Sally.
Yeah, so I will. I'll, if you're okay with that, Sally, I will send Jake your email address, and Jake can help you with that. Lovely. So unless there are any other questions that need to, anyone would like to ask, Is that you all finished, Jake?
Yeah, it's everything from me.
Fabulous, awesome. Do you mind going to the next slide? So the next slide is just another dig for questions. So if anyone else has anything else that they would like to ask, we're going to finish very shortly. So please ask us any of your questions related to this. But I would like to reiterate all of the information that we have discussed, as well as a recording and any specific links, as well as other kind of useful content for you, will be sent out this week as a follow-up. So if you do have any questions that might come later after kind of digesting this information, as always, please get in contact with us and we'd be more than happy to help you however we can. So I think if we go to the next slide, probably, yeah, the closing slide. So thank you so much, everyone, again. Some really great engagement with this webinar, which we always love to see. And it really makes us very happy that, you guys are engaging with us and hopefully finding these webinars useful. We are taking a break next month from this because we, to prevent you from having webinar overload, we do have some separate content for our publisher and service provider customers, but we will be picking this series up again, and we'll make sure you guys have all of the relevant information that you will need for that. But yes, if you do have any suggestions, please email me or the contact inbox. Yeah, I hope you guys have a lovely rest of your day or evening, wherever you are. And I'm sure we'll speak to you all again very shortly. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks,
Goodbye.
everybody.
Cheers, everyone.